Reverend Dr. Eduardo Fernandez is a member of the Society of Jesus. He is a professor of practical theology and missiology at the Jesuit School of Theology at Santa Clara University in California. He holds the doctorate in sacred theology from the Gregorian University in Rome. A native of El Paso, Texas, he is a preeminent Latino theologian whose scholarship and pedagogy model a doing of teología y pastoral en y de conjunto. His research, publications, and teaching demonstrate options made for those who are most vulnerable in contemporary society and church, as well as dedication to the academic, pastoral, and spiritual formation of ministers and theological educators. Fernandez's creative engagements at the intersections of the grassroots, the arts, and theology reflect a narrative style rooted in lo cotidiano, the struggles and joys of daily living, especially at the margins. His many publications include the award-winning Mexican American Catholics, a favorite among CTU, Hispanic Theology and Ministry degree students, and his now classic survey of early Latino theology, La Cosecha, Harvesting Contemporary United States Hispanic Theology, 1972 through 1998. Among his publications in popular Catholicism, sacraments, and liturgy are the co-authored book, La Vida Sacra, Contemporary Hispanic Sacramental Theology with Jake Emperor, and the chapter, Liturgies and Sacraments Latinamente, in the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Latino Theology. Eddie Fernandez shares many commitments with CTU, most especially an understanding of theology as a contextual endeavor, as God talk in multiple vernaculars. Over the years, he has cultivated numerous relationships with our faculty and religious communities, taught our students through the Hispanic Summer Program, and in June 2001, CTU was the site of his presidential address and colloquium as president of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States, who also honored him later with the Virgilio Elizondo Award for Excellence in Theology. It is a privilege to introduce nuestro CTU amigo, Eduardo Fernandez S.J., and for 25 years, mi hermano y compañera con nuestra gente en la lucha, Eddie Fernandez.
Ay, 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 wow. What to say? All right, go to your paper, it always helps. No, it really is a pleasure to be here. As I started thinking about this, I started thinking exactly as Carmen just described, this really feels like coming home. And I think it's the coming home because of the people, because of the past, but it's also because of what we do together in God's reign. Several of you have been personal friends of mine over the years. Maybe even some of you have been my students. And I've always had the greatest respect for this institution, this community of living theological inquiry. At first, when I thought about all that you've contributed to the theological and pastoral world, Bob Schreider with his pioneering Constructing Local Theologies, Steve Bevins with your models of contextual theology, I felt a little intimidated. But I must tell you how Steve saved me at my doctoral defense. I just got to tell you, otherwise it's going to be distracting. So there I am, scared to death, because we have public defenses of the STD in Rome at the Greg. And so there's this big red table, remember that? And this aula, and I'm sweating bullets. I was so nervous, I had forgotten to take my dissertation to the defense. So one of the brothers ran home at the Bellarmino and brought it to the defense. So I'm so nervous. And then I'm just going along, and at one point, the dean, Father Jesus Lopez Guy, says to me, well, Father Fernandez, models. What does all this have to do with theology? I thought, oh my goodness, I felt like I was crashing and burning right there on the spot. If he's asking me this, he obviously has not understood. But there's a wonderful thing in Italian culture called bella figura. Bella figura. And bella figura was that Steve was there and had written the book on which the models I was using was based, and was a graduate of the Greg. So he said, now, Father Bevins, I understand Father Fernandez is using your models. So do you have anything to say? So Steve stood up and defended me. And that's why I'm here today. So that's a short way of telling you how I got my STD. I know that sounds very funny, but don't think about that. So there's also, among the people here that I know and love, is our dear Carmen Nanco Fernandez, my prima querida. And her theologizing in Spanglish means that you roll up your sleeves, you work side by side to keep the academy real, connected, and committed to never forgetting the preferential option for the poor. To this all-star cast, I also add Roger Schroeder, whose book, Done with Steve, I always assign when introducing World Mission. Edward Foley helped James Emper and me at the consultation phase of our book on Latino sacramental theology. The book is called Vida Sacra. And also, Mark Francis, your work continues to orient me again and again, especially in the important role popular religiosity is playing in our theology and our liturgical celebrations. There are these wonderful videos that go with this book, Primero Dios. And in one of the videos, and I have the English version, but they recorded a lot of it in Spanish. So there is this wonderful scene from San Fernando Cathedral, and so they have the image of Christ, and they're bringing down the image of Christ from the cross. And right then, they go to Mark, and Mark says in Spanish, Esta gente, ¿qué está haciendo? Yo pensé, ¿qué está pasando? What is happening to these people? What are they doing? Why are they doing this? And it was this wonderful honesty with which your first exposure said, what is this all about? And yet, throughout the videos, you and some others, there's a lot of interviews kind of unpack all that for us. I could go on and on with your scholars and contributions, such as Don Sr.'s work in migrant theology, Joanne Doy's, your innovative pilgrimages to Japanese American internment camps. But I hope it's clear to you all by now that I have the greatest respect for you and for your work. Having said that, I must confess that I felt a little bit intimidated being asked to give this annual World Mission lecture. Yet I thought to myself, they invited me. And they invited me for a purpose. And then this kind of took me back to when my first book came out, La Cosecha. I was so nervous when that book came out. I got the box from Liturgical Press. I knew it was a couple of copies of the book. So I went into my office and I locked the door. And then I thought, you have to do this. You have to open the box. So I opened the box, and then it was the back of the book. And I thought, oh, my name will be misspelled or something. I didn't check right. And I slowly turned it over, and it all looked okay. And I thought, well, I'm going to have class now. I guess I should take it to class, right? That's what professors do, okay? So I take my book to class, and I show it like this, and I bring it down right away. I was so nervous. I could feel my face go red. And throughout that first book and interviews and so forth, I came to the realization that I thought, why is this so difficult? Why is it so difficult to talk about your work? And I finally had to think about what's going to be my attitude toward this book, because this is an introduction to U.S. Latina and Latino theology. And one of the things that became important to me was I thought of waiters who serve food and the importance of a waiter to have pride in what you serve. And I thought, I think I'm like a waiter. That's what I'm doing. I've collected the best of these recipes, which come from the people, and now I'm serving it. Can I serve it with pride? Or do I have to feel like I have to hide in my office? That was very important for me. So here go a few thoughts. It kind of reminded me of, it's not about me. And we often forget that in the academy. It's about the stories of people that you want to hear about. And so that's why I'm here, to share those stories. Some of these thoughts may be a little scattered in some places, and some of you who've had me in class can understand that. But they're little examples of what I'm learning, especially from the border, and how these lessons are gifts for all of us, just as good local theologies are making their contributions to global theologies today in the world. So, let me start with a procession on Good Friday morning in Guatemala City with a colleague, the late Alex Garcia Rivera. I'm thinking of Alex especially because I think the last time I was here in Chicago, DePaul had sponsored a colloquium, and Bob Schreider shared lovingly from his last correspondence with him, with this great Alex, who in many ways was like my big brother at the school. In Guatemala, my host and good friend and brother Jesuit, Marco Tulio Martinez, had shared some stories around a certain 17th century Cristo, which is customarily carried that day in this solemn procession. It reminded me of when I had been in Seville for Semana Santa, the same holy season, Holy Week. I remembered some stories of these Cristos. And one of the stories I remembered was there was a certain Cristo that many of the gypsies would be present for that procession. And the story goes that in a tavern, one of the gypsies, and remember, gypsies are really looked down upon in many of these regions. And the story goes that this gypsy was stabbed in a tavern. And as he was dying, there was an artist there, and he saw his agonizing face. And from that face, from the memory of that face, he sculptured this Cristo. So it's the suffering Christ that is carried through the streets in Sevilla. So back to Guatemala. As I gazed at the stunning alfombras along the route, and these are tapestries made of colorful sawdust and other materials, all this evoked in me to see this Cristo, this bloody, broken Cristo being carried in procession through the streets, evoked in me feelings of awe, sadness, life, offering, celebration, particularly as experienced in this community, which was recovering from its own dirty war. One in which it is estimated that 80% of the casualties of the war in Guatemala were indigenous Mayans. The image of the suffering Christ was now in sight. Billowing clouds of incense announced its arrival. The solemn music and formal dress of the cargadores, or those carrying the image, told me that we were being visited by someone who was no stranger to pain. As the procession went by, I carefully aimed my camera and took shot after shot. Soon after, however, I felt Marco Tulio nudge me. Mira eso. Pay attention to that. He whispered reverently. A few persons away from me was a boy, about 12 or so, who together with other boys had helped carry one of the images surrounded by fresh flowers. As he quietly wept, being held by his father underneath his mother's gaze, so as if to say, "It's okay, son. I know what you are feeling. I've been there, and what you feel is real." In hours of conversation after with Marco Tulio and Alex, I gradually began to understand, as Marco Tulio so eloquently put it, the power of symbol to evoke, that is, call out what is in the heart, provoke, or call out that which was unexpected, and convoke, or call together in the sense of the need to reflect with others on something so profound. I can still hear him say emphatically in Spanish, el símbolo evoca, provoca, convoca. I start this presentation with this story to invite you into the mystery of storytelling. In 2018, Christmas Eve, I got a call from Rivera Garcia, one of the founders and now the director of Annunciation House in El Paso. This house has over a 40-year history. It was started during the Central American War to provide sanctuary for thousands of refugees and migrants. Up until recent times, it was receiving as many as 1,000 people a day. The Posada, or Christmas celebration, which included reenacting Mary and Jesus' search for lodging so that they could give birth to Jesus, was canceled. I was scheduled to preside at the Eucharist, one in which we invited everyone present to share a light, small as it might seem. That was a light that was illuminating them amidst the darkness that threatened to engulf them. Remember, many of the people there would be undocumented. Many of them would have crossed very recently. Many of the stories told over the years around this light, as the adult or child literally held a candle, I shall never forget. Here goes one. So think about this. We're all crowded into the little front room of Annunciation House, a very old house, and we're just all crowded in there. And so we've done the posada, we've gone to search, we've knocked on doors and been turned away in the neighborhood. And finally we are welcomed there at Annunciation House. And the kids are dressed up as Joseph and Mary, and some of them are shepherds, and all of the scene is going on. And then what we do is we turn out the lights, we get a candle, and we say, what light do you have this Christmas, despite the darkness? And it always begins with tears. That Mass always begins with tears because we ask people to remember who they wish could be here. And so there's a lot of stillness and sadness because people are away from, mothers are away from their kids, it's Christmas, etc. So picture that environment. So there's this place, and there was a little boy, I can still see him. During the posada, I was kind of directing the posada and keeping the kids in line and so forth and trying to get a little order there. And this kid was just so rambunctious, but he was St. Joseph. So he had to knock on the door. That's what St. Joseph does, right? And he has to look tired and sad, and that's what St. Joseph does, and comfort, and okay, so, but it had been a challenge. So finally, we've made it. We've gotten in the house. And so I say to the assembly, who has a light? And people they hold a candle, and they share the light, and it's in the darkness. And then the little boy raises his hand. I'm thinking, oh boy. Okay, here we go. All right, come on up. So then I put a chair. He was a little guy. I put him on the chair, and he's holding the candle, And I'm just thinking, what is he going to say? Okay, here we go. So I said, well, what light do you have to share this Christmas? And he smiles, he said, Esta Navidad, this Christmas, mi luz es, my light is, mi hermanito nuevo. I have a new little brother, and he's over there in the corner with my mother. I thought, Christmas Eve, this newborn child in the mother of his arms in this very poor sanctuary. If that isn't the story of Christmas, what is? Anyway, going back to not this Christmas Eve, but the one before, the call from Ruben, who says, we've got to cancel the posada. He went on to explain that night, and has happened consequently for the days which were to follow, ICE, the U.S. Department of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, had dropped off hundreds of migrants or refugees at the local Greyhound bus station, not far from Annunciation House. So it was only about a 15-minute walk from there. These had been persons who had been detained, processed, and were now awaiting asylum hearings. Ruben was emphatic. As one of the volunteers said, tonight we have to do the real posada. That is, these women, children, and men have nowhere to go and it's freezing outside. We have to receive them with love and get them to where they need to be, hopefully soon, where they can stay with family and friends in the U.S. for the time being as they're awaiting their hearings. As the holidays were upon us, remember, this is Christmas Eve, and buses and planes packed and volunteers scarce, it was no small feat, but they did it, much to my amazement. Over the years, even before it was in the media that ICE had started separating families at the border, I saw the number of children at this celebration diminishing, and I wondered what was going on. The children just dressed as Joseph and Mary, the sanctuary house of where the celebration was to be, did not happen. Somehow they seemed out of place in more ways than one. Joseph and Mary, no baby. Since that Christmas Eve, I told myself that I had to make a concerted effort to collect these stories, that somehow beneath these usually brown and sometimes black faces, there lay endless stories, stories of the struggle, pain, and separation, yet also surprisingly, as I heard over the years in the sharing of Annunciation House, stories of courage and hope. And keep in mind that I grew up about 10 minutes from the border. Literally from my house, I could walk to the U.S.-Mexican border. My first attempt at collecting these stories has been to interview persons who over the years have been involved in providing immediate hospitality, such as Ruben Garcia, the layman I previously mentioned, or Sister B, an 85-year-old Irish retired sister full of passion and hope, who has fallen in love with the so-called nuns. Not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S, or religiously non-affiliated young people who are coming to volunteer and educate them through various student immersion programs. I also read over the evaluations of about 10 such groups who came to do a border experience with Casa Encuentro. It's a recent project started by Maris and Jesuits in the El Paso, Ciudad Juárez area to help educate youth and parish groups in the area of immigrant justice. Some of those I interviewed, like Mike Gallagher, a Jesuit lawyer who up until recently represented the Jesuit Refugee Service at the UN in Geneva, shared with me examples of countries such as Turkey or Uganda, who do a much better job than our own in integrating socially and economically these misplaced persons fleeing violence and oppression. I now return to the powerful ability of symbols to evoke, provoke, and convoke. Evocan, provocan, y convocan. Such stories are not only filled with symbols, but are themselves symbolic. Because, as the roots of its Latin etymology reveals, a symbol brings together, as opposed to something diabolical. That is something which tears apart. These stories, therefore, for example, when they function as myth or meaning stories, help situate us in the cosmos. In the words of our dear Alex, they are the little stories that form part of the big story, the God story, the Jesus story. They tell us where we come from and where we are going. For example, in preaching at sacramental celebrations, which often function as sacred rites of passage, whether they be of initiation, maturation, commitment, or even around sickness and death, I find that these persons' little stories, that of their own origin, their struggles, their giftedness, their dreams, form a part of a larger God story. One which reflects the story of a creator, redeemer, and sustainer, one who keeps broadening our horizons, something Bernard Lonergan refers to as conversion. In the case of immersion experiences, for example, I am immediately drawn to their evocative aspect, that ability to draw out what is in the heart. Especially for those who grew up away from the U.S.-Mexican border or not travel beyond tourist areas in Mexico or other parts of Latin America, the economic poverty one hears described or experienced in the vulnerability of these migrants, especially children, is often heart-wrenching. This really kind of took me back to when I was a kid. As I said, we grew up about 10 minutes from the U.S.-Mexican border, and we were a large family. We were 11 kids, 8 boys. So my dad used to take us across the border to get haircuts. You could get a haircut for 50 cents. And they would also buy sugar and other things. And I remember one time I didn't want to go. And this is one of my earliest memories. And so I'm there, and they're gathering all the boys. My dad's going to take us for haircuts. And I don't want to go, I don't want to go, I don't want to go. And finally my dad said, "Why don't you want to go?" And then I said, "It's so sad, Dad. It's so sad. There's so many children begging." And then I started crying, because it took me back to when we would sit in the car and kids would come up to the car and beg. And my dad had been an orphan, so he always gave them money. But I said, "Dad, it's so sad. I don't want to go. I don't want to go." So now think about these young college students who are having these experiences on the border. In the evaluations, I ran across such comments as, "Lots of feelings. I felt so much love, pain, sadness, and anger. I don't want to leave it all. I've grown so much. I want to be more in the community. Just thinking about how we can all be connected." This was a student at Rockhurst, a child of immigrants. And the children of immigrants really wrote some very powerful, among the other things that were written, in which they said, "Now I know what my parents went through. And it's so helpful to have the story being told, and I don't have to tell it, but I can appreciate what they went through." Another student wrote, "Going to the presentation at the Lutheran Church was especially disturbing. Learning how the children were treated was horrible." Another student, "Meaning is so hard to put into words. A passion that I didn't know I had was ignited in me." One student from a college in the Deep South summed it up this way: "I learned that you have to have the courage to have your heart broken." What about the power of these symbolic stories? One's often heard from the persons who themselves have lived to describe the difficult passage of those who receive them, to provoke or call out that which was unexpected. Again and again, I read about the students' appreciation of another narrative around immigration, which is different than that being told by the politicians using migrants and refugees as scapegoats, echoing back to similar periods of history, such as the early 30s, when during the Great Depression, thousands of Mexicans were deported. Persons who had not received the advantage of documentation when they had entered the country as refugees in the early part of the 20th century, fleeing the violence of the Mexican Revolution. Coupled with some interdisciplinary content around push-pull factors connected with migration, including opportunities to hear from persons in the Border Patrol, and about 50 of them are Latino. And think about what that must do to you. As a Latino Border Patrol agent, and you have to carry out your job. And Ruben told me, he says, there's some real cognitive dissonance going on there. Because, you understand what the kids are saying to each other. You understand that, like he told me this story about when they were separating them, and the little boy is saying, Papi, yo no quiero ir. I don't want to go. No quiero que me separen. I don't want to be separated. And so you, the agent, having to do this is understanding everything that is going on, and you've got kids their age at home. Think about how difficult that must be. These immersion programs draw from what Levinas describes as the power of the encounter, when the other ceases to be other. Brother Todd, a Marist whose background is in experiential education, shared with me the following. The most impactful for the participants is meeting the migrants themselves. Because remember, there's these different centers, and they will take the students to visit and spend time in the center. As he heard from one of the chaperones of a certain conservative youth who nonetheless remained open to the experience, it's really hard to hate up close. It's really hard to hate up close. Here, the Google Language app has helped them to have preliminary conversations, because I kept wondering, Todd, how do they communicate? A lot of those kids don't speak Spanish. And even for some of the refugees and the migrants, Spanish is not their first language. It's often an indigenous language. Well, Google Translate. Another comment he heard, when you meet them and they cease to be other, it's really hard to excuse mistreating them. Ruben had told me years ago, he said, this whole thing is changing us here in El Paso. Because providing hospitality, and they have about 13 parishes, among them are 2 Protestant congregations, some high schools. The bishop opened up a place at the seminary. A lot of volunteers, lots and lots of volunteers. They just opened this warehouse, which they has as many as 500 cots now. It's a big warehouse they're renting, and they have portalets outside. But you can see the numbers, but everything's changed because of the difference in policy, and people are awaiting on the other side. Finally, how is it that such new symbolic narratives convoke, that is, call together a move to greater unity? Brother Todd told me, for example, that one of the desires of the students when they leave these immersions, one which he invites them to articulate in their evaluations, is to go back to their places with new eyes that perceive borders in the places where they come from, eyes that see those on the margin and how to better their solidarity with them. Because he asked them that in the evaluation. And I think this is so clever. Because in the midst of all this, and the kids are thinking, how do I take this back? How do I tell all my friends that are hearing all this stuff and telling me you're just repeating fake news? And so he gets them to think about who are the people who are marginalized back in your community? And what could you do possibly so they wouldn't be marginalized? He recently got an email from a university staff member who told him that almost all the students who made one of these encuentros some months back have now changed their major or are looking to how they can use that major to help with immigration. So, lest I go on and on and on, I'm now going to try to pull it together and have a little focus here. Focus, focus, focus. I often tell my students, I want to see an F on your forehead for focus. So I better put one on myself. Here we go. Let me see if I can summarize these lessons for you. First one, know your history. Know your history. Not only the history of the U.S., I'm finding out lots of stuff in this work that I didn't even know about my own state in Texas. You know, the great Texas Rangers did some horrible things. On and on and on. I mean, how many of us knew about the Japanese American internment camps? All this stuff, the lynchings, there's all this stuff we don't know our own history. And often, as Greer Gordon told us, immigrants stop telling their stories because they're so painful. And so those stories don't get passed on, and we don't realize all the pain that's there. So get to know your own history. Someone said that racism is our country's birth defect. Think about that. Racism is our country's birth defect. We were born with racism. Also, our personal story. And I'm so happy now with Ancestry.com and sites like that. People want to know their story, and then it raises other questions. Oh, so my grandfather came from Italy? Oh, so you're not going to tell me that WHOP means without papers? Is that true? You see the linkages there. I'm amazed in my classes. Whenever I teach anything somehow related to culture, especially around hybridity or mestizaje, there are always students there that are on a quest. And I don't always see it, but they're on a quest. They've got a story. And the stories usually go something like this. My grandmother, there were rumors that she was indigenous, but we never talked about it. We didn't know what kind of indigenous group she was at, but I feel like that was too bad. Or stories like, I grew up, my grandmother was from Germany, and we were not taught German, and my grandmother couldn't speak English. So you can quote your grandmother in Spanish, but I can't quote my grandmother in German because of the war. So German was bad. We all have skeletons in our ancestral closets. Number 2. Don't go at it alone. Don't go at it alone. This work is way too important. As you heard in the beginning, I've learned a lot from you all, not to mention about a quarter of a century of students. When I wrote this down, I thought, are you sure you got that right? You know, have you been there that long? Okay, 23 years, but I taught before going there. And many of the students are international. And this is such a gift to us. You international students, God bless you. You see things that we cannot see. And sometimes when you see them, it drives us crazy. Because you see things we can't see. And we think we're born here. We should be able to see all this. No. Insider, outsider. Don't go at it alone. The book we did with Steve Bevins, Doing Theology as if People Mattered, in many ways is a testimony to my faculty to that. So we asked our faculty, our sisters and brothers, tell us about the experience of these last 20 years or so, of what the international students have taught you or of doing theology contextually have taught you. And as Steve can verify, I love the essays. We were filled with surprises that people told stories about how, like Bill O'Neill, how Africa changed him forever. Examples like that. So we need to keep doing teología, as Carmen reminded us, en conjunto. desde conjunto, together. Let's not forget how much practitioners can teach us in the academy full time. I love bringing in practitioners, especially women who are often in diocesan offices, who know so much, have so much experience, and can share it with us. As a boy growing up in a mission town, Isleta, outside El Paso, I learned from Andrea Silva how to do a posada. Her knowledge, together with composers Rosa Marta Zárate and Francisco Herrera, inspired me to stage a large one recently at the Los Angeles Religious Ed Conference. They told me there was a workshop. Fine, I designed the workshop, and then they said, oh, by the way, the room has a capacity of 2,700. Oh, okay. I guess we won't be breaking them up into groups of 5. Maybe we will. Maybe we'll do stuff on the board. I don't know. So then I'm in the shower one day and I get this great idea. Let's do a posada. Let's just divide up half the group. Some will be inside, others will be outside. I found a great posada that we do that's up to date. It doesn't have all this archaic Spanish language. It's modern day language that mentions ICE and says, I'm going to call the migra, I'm going to call ICE on you. And it was so living. And people told me after, that was so powerful. One guy from Calexico said, I couldn't even sing it anymore. I was sobbing. It was so real. 3, beware of so-called quick solutions. As Teilhard de Chardin reminds us, trust in the slow work of God. Trust in the slow work of God. These encounters or border immersions, as well as those which take us out of our comfort zones, can often be seeds or even rites of passage to global citizenship. Think of the beauty of that. That for people, especially who've never been out of the country or never seen poverty, this is like a rite of passage to global citizenship. As mentioned, the Casa Encuentro experience in El Paso, Juárez invites the participants to start to imagine how they will apply what they have learned to reach out to marginalized persons in their own communities back home. Number 4, don't judge. Don't judge. There are 2 truths, yours and mine, and the one in between. Theology has a lot to learn from other disciplines, especially the arts and the social sciences. I was really blown away in the book, Doing Theology as If People Mattered, by an essay of Father George Williams, who is the chaplain at San Quentin. And he's the chaplain of death row. And I heard him share one night, we were having a faith sharing among the Jesuits. He said, I have the best job in the world. I love my job. I love my job. I meet these incredible persons on death row. And so he writes an essay there called Imprisoned Theology, in which he follows one of the inmates, someone who had murdered a family. It's quite powerful, Imprisoned Theology. In his pastoral letter after the terrible massacre of 22 persons at the El Paso Walmart, you all remember that in the news, Bishop Mark Zeitz, Bishop of El Paso, in that letter, I was reading that on the plane last night, and I thought, did I really read this? You know what he says in that letter? Part of what he says in terms of grieving and so forth. But he asks in the letter, towards the closing of the letter, that the attacker, Patrick Crusius, be spared from execution. In his words, this is the bishop's words, he says, justice is certainly required, but the cycle of hate, blood, and vengeance on the border must meet its end. While the scales of justice may seem to tilt in favor of the necessity of lethal retribution, God offers us yet another chance to choose life, choose in a manner worthy of our humanity. Number 5, engage the arts. I was struck to see pictures of matachines. These are indigenous dancers, both at the International Wall, the president has constantly been promoting, as well as in the parking lot of the Cielo Vista Walmart, the site of the massacre. And I saw these pictures and I thought, what's going on? So you have these indigenous dancers, and I grew up with these. I could hear the drumming, the beautiful colors, and they're dancing by the wall, and they're dancing in the parking lot of the Walmart. And viscerally, I thought, what's going on? Why are they dancing? Why dance at the sight of these two painful realities? But sisters and brothers, dance is about life, resistance, harmony with Mother Earth, and prayer. I quickly learned their dance is not for entertainment. Their dance is prayer. I remember at my 25th anniversary, I'm from a mission town outside of El Paso in Isleta. And I was invited by the chief of the Pueblo Indians to be smudged. And so I remember the smell, and we had seen the eagle dance right there in front of the mission. I had been baptized at that church. My grandparents had been married there, and the chief had this eagle feather, and I bow down, and he takes these incense, and he says to me, "You come from here. You belong here. You always have a place here. Never forget where you are from." Engage the arts. Engage sacred liturgy. As the sources for provocative border justice, art from the border, for example. One is the Arte de Lágrimas project by Dr. Greg Cuellar at the Austin Seminar. And he and his wife will go to the Greyhound bus stations where people have been released, and they'll give the kids art material. And the kids will draw, and they'll ask him questions. What do you remember? And so forth. And then he'll talk to them. And he has a whole display of this. We did this at Union recently. And he brought out this little tenny that a mother carried of her daughter. And it had like a clip in it that was holding the tenny together. But there was just something so powerful, so sacramental, to hold this little tenny that had crossed the desert and to see that art there. Another one, and again, for me, what amazes me is the stories of resistance. There was the other project, Uncaged Art, Tornillo Children's Detention Camp, in which, and they will share with you the images free of charge. And what they did is they asked kids in these detention camps, remember the tent cities outside of El Paso? This is in Tornillo. And so what they did is they asked the kids something that gives you strength and reminds you of home. Lots of images of the Quetzales. They gave them arts material. They did images of churches. They did soccer. They did dress, all kinds of things like beauty. You know, you've tried to take everything away from us, but you cannot take this away from us. 6, there are only 7, like the 7 sacraments, so I'm almost there. I'm just winding it down here. Number 6, walking with Jesus. Sometimes we are called to be host, but other times we are called to be guests. What happened last Christmas Eve? We had the posada, and we had it in the warehouse. And about 450 people came. It was powerful, powerful, powerful. And we kind of divided different places where we knocked on the door. But what blew me, I kept thinking, why was this posada so powerful? And I think one of the reasons why is we who thought we were the hosts, welcoming the migrants and refugees, they were the hosts because they knew the posada. And many people had never been to a posada there. So we made it bilingual. And what everybody watched, you know, those of you who do liturgy with kids, you get the kids engaged, you've got everybody, baby. People love to see the kids engaged, you know. And so the kids were engaged because they could play all these roles, and we had lots of little sheep, and every now and then we'd hand the microphone to the kids and they would make sheep noises. Bah! Bah! They were so good. You know, they could have won Academy Awards for their sheep plays. But they were, and then we moved them wherever we could. We gave them candles. We did Silent Night like this, and Feliz Navidad by Jose Feliciano. There was just this incredible joy. And we thought, if they can be happy and teach us about fiesta, in all that they've been through, we can learn from them. And this brings us to number 7. God's fiesta, the eschatological banquet, it's the E word. Okay? The eschatological banquet will always have the last word, baby. It is this divine love which ultimately convokes us, empowering us to collaborate with God and helping to create a more just world, to contribute our little grain of salt to the construction of the kingdom, to work to create unity amidst diversity. I want to leave you with the response of Sister B. Remember, she's the 85-year-old Irish sister at Casa Vidas, this place of sanctuary. And so I asked B, tell me what you think the Spirit is doing here through these events and encounters on the border. And B smiled and said, the Spirit is renewing the face of the earth through the groups that are coming here. For instance, just this week, I think there was an organization, I think it was started by the Mercy Sisters. But the Jews came together, the Muslims came together, the Protestants, the Catholics, united forces to have a day of prayer with hundreds of people for children on the border. It was in the National Catholic Reporter where they had photos. They had an elementary school involved where the 8th graders held up photos of the children who had died on the border. There was one child, Wilfred was his name, who at 2:30 died in the hospital. Here, his body was downstairs in our dining room. We had his Mass presided by Bishop Zeitz in this very place. These things are causing groups to come together like never before. It's more ecumenical and interreligious now. The same thing happened here. The ecumenical service after the 22 people were killed at the Walmart last summer. I think that there is so much good coming out of all the bad that is happening. Thank you, Sister B. Thank you for reminding us not to lose hope, to continue to fight the good fight, and to know that ultimately it is God who will see us through. Thank you very much.